No, it's not that lengthy like in other countries. But in any case, we'll take a brief look at these 3 PDFs and talk about the history of Canadian trade. The Canada we know today exists because of trade. After Columbus's success in exploring the New World and exploiting its riches, other explorers set out to find what lay across the ocean. In the 1600s, ships from France and England landed in what is now Canada, sailing up the St. Lawrence River to Quebec. There, they traded with First Nations peoples for fur and food, and sent their treasures back to their home country. This international business was so prosperous that settlers from France and England soon moved to Canada to establish colonies and trading outposts, notably the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company. And we all know the Hudson's Bay Company, the Eaton Centre in Toronto. It's a major shopping centre for many Canadians, and it was established in 46. They've got a sign on their building at the Hudson Bay Company in Toronto at Bay and Queen. It's one of the oldest corporations in Canada. Many First Nations, notably the Ojibwe and the Cree, traded with the Europeans. Representatives from these nations would often bring the furs, mainly beaver pelts, that they had trapped to European trading posts and exchange them for rifles, blankets, and other goods they needed. First Nations also acted as middlemen, trading furs for prized European manufactured items, and then trading these items for more furs from nations much further west. The traders would bring newly acquired furs to the trading posts and strike new deals. So that is the beginning of Canadian trade. We've got the Europeans who come, let's take a look at the map on the next PDF, from England and France. They come this way through the Hudson Strait, down the Hudson Bay, and then come into these areas by water, of course, or they come across the Atlantic and then up through the St. Lawrence River, Montreal, and they continue into Lake Ontario, and this is where Toronto is, and then they continued and went up this way into Lake Superior. So Europeans came across and they met at the outposts with First Nations people. They collected furs, notably beaver pelts, and if you recall, what animal is on our Canadian currency, the nickel? The beaver. And that was the beginning of international trade in Canada. European trade. Once permanent settlements were established in Halifax, Montreal, Quebec, Ottawa, Kingston, and Toronto during the 1700s, trade grew very quickly. There was little manufacturing taking place in Canada at this time, so finished goods came from British or French businesses overseas. In turn, the demand in Europe for raw materials from Canada, especially beaver pelts, fish, and lumber, grew rapidly. During this time, France and England were fighting the 7 Years' War in both Europe and Canada, especially in Nova Scotia, Louisbourg, and Quebec City, and the Plains of Abraham, 1759. The defeat of the French led to greater reliance on trade from England and less on trade from France. Canada's historical connection to Britain remains strong. It is currently one of Canada's top 5 trading partners. Canada's geography was shaped in part by early trade. Traders needed to settle near water as they relied on ships to send their raw products back to Britain or France. This is why many major Canadian cities have ports. And if you recall, most of Canada's population is centered along the 49th parallel. In response to keeping the Americans back, but leading from the major bodies of water. All of the goods required for settlement came from Europe by ship. The same was true for the United States, as their cities, too, developed near the Atlantic seacoast and inland waterways, such as the Great Lakes. The United States was building its trade economy at the same time that Canada was, and because of the proximity to their cities, our cities grew. It was only a matter of time before the two countries became trading partners. Trade with the United States. The United States declared its independence from Britain and fought for that independence in the American Revolutionary War in the late 1700s. As a result of the sudden decrease of trade with Britain, the United States had to become self-reliant. This need for independent sources of manufactured goods coincided almost perfectly with the Industrial Revolution. In 1775, 1 year before the Americans won independence, James Watt invented the steam engine, which provided cheap power to run machines. American Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin in 1794. The cotton gin was an automated device that separated cottonseed from raw cotton fibers, a job that was exceptionally labor-intensive. Whitney's invention increased production of clean, raw cotton dramatically and revolutionized the cotton industry in the United States, making the cotton industry the profitable backbone of the southern states. Other inventions and developments quickly followed, which led to the rapid growth of American industry. Canada, meanwhile, was still dependent on Britain, which had no interest in developing a manufacturing base so far away from the home country. Instead, Britain used Canada's wealth of natural resources to feed the factories that were springing up in England. Canada also became a supplier of raw materials, notably wheat and timber, to manufacturers in the United States. And this is an image of the cotton gin of the 1800s. So this is the machine that replaced humans in that labor-intensive job. The early manufacturing lead that America took over Canada is still obvious today. The industrial jobs created by the growth of manufacturing in the United States were labor-intensive and required more workers. As immigrants moved to the United States to work, the country experienced huge population growth and expansion westward. The U.S. grew much faster than Canada, and its plants and factories expanded rapidly as well. During this time, Canadian businesses were mainly resource-based, producing coal, lumber, oil, and agricultural products. Our economy was dependent upon trade with Britain and America for most of the manufactured goods we needed. The U.S. continues to be our largest trading partner, and American brands can now be found everywhere in Canada. The United States still relies upon Canada's raw materials, notably oil and water. Canada's exports to the U.S. in 2008 amounted to $375 billion, and our imports from the U.S. were $227 billion. Manufacturing jobs are decreasing in both Canada and the United States as cheaper labor and improved technology make it more economical to send manufacturing jobs to Asia. In this table, we can see Canada's trade with the U.S. by the numbers 2007. So 21.37% of U.S. exports that went to Canada more than any other country. So Canada's trade with the U.S., so 21.37% of U.S. exports went to Canada more than any other country. 16.03% of U.S. imports that came from Canada. The only country that imported more was China. 331 value in million U.S. dollars of Canada's exports to the U.S. So that's how much Canada exports in dollars to the United States. This is all in 2007. And 220 million is the value of Canada's imports from the United States. So Canada exported 331 million and it imported, that means it brought into Canada $220 million worth of goods. In these two charts, we can see the top 10 domestic exports to the US. So what are the products that we send to the US and their value in millions of Canadian dollars? So number 1, crude petroleum oils, 41 million. Motor vehicles, so cars that are produced in Canada, 32 million. Natural gas, 27 million. Trucks, 8 million. Smaller motor vehicles, 6 million. Heavy petroleum oil preparations, 6 million. Lumber, 5 million. Light petroleum oil preparations, 5 million. Medications, 3 million. Parts and accessories of motor vehicles, 3 million. So you can see most of the things that we sell to the US have to do with oil. We've got oil, or cars, trucks, or car parts, and also lumber and medications. So those are the main things that we've exported to the US. And these are the top 10 imports from the US. These are the things that we bring in from the United States in millions of Canadian dollars. So motor vehicles, although we sell motor vehicles to the US, we also buy or bring in vehicles from the US, 7 million. Smaller motor vehicles, 7 million. Trucks, 6 million. Parts of motor vehicles, so car or truck parts, 5 million. Reciprocating piston engines, 5 million. Gearboxes, transmissions for motor vehicles, so car parts again, 3 million. Natural gas. Notice over here we export natural gas to the US, 27 million, but we also import it. Later we'll talk about why we export to the US and we also bring it in from the US. And then heavy petroleum oil preparations. We export light and heavy, and we also buy heavy oil from the US, and we also buy motor vehicle parts as well from the US. And aircraft. We buy aircraft from the US, 2 million. Okay, so that summarizes a basic, brief history of Canadian trade. And we will stop there. In another presentation, we'll look at the next PDFs.